The sky over Birmingham was heavy with smoke. Chimneys rose like sentinels over the city, their plumes joining the gray sky in a quiet pact of permanence. Here, in the neighborhood of Aston, the air smelled of soot and factory grease. Streets were narrow and crowded with terraced houses pressed shoulder to shoulder like tired workers at the end of a shift. This was where John Michael Osbourne was born on a damp December day in 1948, the fifth of 6 children. He arrived in a world as hard as the iron the city was known for. His father, Jack, worked days and nights at the General Electric Company, bringing home enough to keep food on the table, but little more. His mother, Lillian, took care of the house. Though keeping a home in Aston was like trying to keep the damp from the walls. No matter how hard you worked, it crept back in. The house on Lodge Road was small, its walls thin enough that voices from the next room, or the neighbors, could easily find their way in. The Osbourne home was noisy, cramped, and chaotic. But it was never truly silent in Aston. There was always a distant hammering, a factory whistle, or the clatter of trolley buses along the street. Ozzy, a name that wouldn't come until later, learned it early that life was a clamor of noise and labor. He was a small boy, often sickly, often frightened of the world around him. At school, he struggled. Numbers swam before his eyes, letters blurred. Later, he would discover that dyslexia had stolen the ease of reading from him. But in those days, he simply believed himself stupid. His classmates didn't help. They laughed when he stumbled, mocked when he failed to read aloud. Teachers, pressed by large class sizes and their own exhaustion, offered little comfort. The world outside school was no kinder. He was a timid boy, often bullied, often alone. Yet, there were moments of peace. He loved the sound of laughter when his family gathered around the wireless. He adored the silly songs and variety shows that brought a brief brightness to the evenings. And then there was music. Always music, floating from radios and pubs, bringing with it the strange magic of distant voices. The fog that hung over Birmingham was sometimes so thick that gas lamps could barely pierce it. On such days, the world shrank to the length of one's arm, and little boys walked home with hands outstretched to feel their way. Ozzy's memories of childhood carried this blur of grayness, of walls too close together, of voices shouting from unseen places. To escape, he made himself laugh. He became the clown, the joker, twisting his face into silly impressions, making animal sounds. Laughter was a currency he could trade to keep himself from being hit or ignored. Home, though poor, was warm with the unspoken bond of family. His sisters knitted and cleaned. His brothers worked, or got, into trouble. His father was strict but not cruel, and his mother made sure that even if money was scarce, dignity was not. Still, the pull of mischief was strong. The alleys of Aston taught him to steal small things, to run fast, to lie well. He didn't think of himself as bad, just as someone finding ways to survive the boredom and the meanness. At night, in the cramped bedroom he shared with siblings, he'd sometimes hear distant music from the pubs or dance halls. He didn't know yet that music would one day carry him out of these streets. But in the dark, he liked to imagine what kind of life might exist beyond the fog. School was never a sanctuary for John Osbourne. The worn wooden desks and stern faces of teachers offered no reprieve from the gray world outside. Learning seemed like a foreign language to him. The words blurred together, the numbers made no sense. He tried, now and then, to make sense of the blackboard, but it never took long before his mind drifted elsewhere, to silly voices, to the echo of music, to the smell of the factories carried in from the open windows. Most days, He was the class fool. If he could not master the lesson, at least he could make his classmates laugh. He perfected pratfalls, voices, impressions. There was an art to getting a room to laugh before the teacher's cane found your knuckles. And yet, even laughter was a poor shield. The world of the Birmingham schools was as rigid as its factories. You followed the rules, or you were punished. Ozzy, though no one called him that yet, was not built for rules. At home, radio was his solace. Late at night, when the hum of the city quieted, he'd lie in bed and listen to the faint sounds of distant stations. Music carried with it a sense of somewhere else. Places where the sky wasn't so gray, where life didn't smell of iron and grease. Then came 1963. That year changed everything. The Beatles appeared like lightning through the clouded sky. Their music wasn't just sound. It was a map to another world. When Ozzy heard "She Loves You" for the first time, the world tilted. The jangling guitars, the sharp harmonies. It was as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for too long. For the first time, he felt the pull of possibility. He became obsessed. He learned every lyric, mimicked every movement. He wasn't alone. All of Britain was falling under the spell of the Beatles. But for Ozzy, it was more than fandom. It was an awakening. If they could escape Liverpool's grime with music, maybe he could escape Birmingham's. He pestered his father for a radio he could carry with him. When he got one, battered in second hand, it became his most treasured possession. School drifted further from his interest. The more he listened to music, the less he cared for the confines of his classroom. He dropped out at 15, unable to bear the monotony any longer. Work beckoned, if only because it had to. He took on a series of jobs, each one worse than the last. A plumber's apprentice, a construction worker, a horn tuner in a car factory. Each job taught him something, that he wasn't made for this life. It was around this time that his nickname was born. His last name, Osbourne, became Ozzy, a casual moniker from friends that stuck tighter than any label from school. He wore it proudly. John was a boy who couldn't read well, who couldn't work a proper job. But Ozzy was someone else. And Ozzy was beginning to dream of music. He didn't know how to play an instrument, but he knew he wanted to sing. Somewhere between the crackle of the radio and the din of factories, he decided that his voice, odd as it was, might be his ticket out. But dreaming was one thing. Making it real would take something more. The factories of Birmingham held no romance for Ozzy. He drifted from one job to the next, each shift blending into the last. There was the foundry, where molten metal glowed like miniature suns. There was the slaughterhouse, where blood and sawdust became the air he breathed. He didn't stay long anywhere. He wasn't made for clocks and whistles. His hands were clumsy with tools, his mind restless with boredom. When work failed him, he turned to other means. The back streets of Aston had their own economy, one built on taking what you could. Ozzy wasn't a hardened criminal, but he was desperate. With a few mates, he tried his luck at burglary. He was no master thief. In one attempt, they targeted a clothing shop, thinking the goods might fetch a few pounds. They failed to consider the security system. Within minutes, the police were there. Ozzy was caught, and with no money for a decent solicitor, the outcome was predictable. He was sentenced to a short stint in Winson Green Prison. Prison was a shock. The walls were cold, the beds harder still. The days dragged under the eyes of guards who had no patience for petty criminals. Ozzy was just another number, another wayward boy from a gray city. He remembered the stink of the place: damp stone, sweat, and defeat. The sounds echoed, footsteps bouncing off walls, voices reduced to hollow murmurs. Nights were the worst. Sleep did not come easily when surrounded by strangers whose lives had been ground harder than his own. Yet even here, humor was a lifeline. Ozzy made jokes, pulled faces, tried to make others laugh. It was the only way to keep the days from collapsing in on themselves. When he was released, nothing much had changed. The city was still gray. The factories still spewed their endless clouds. But he carried with him a deeper sense of failure. He knew he wasn't a criminal at heart. He was just a boy who didn't know what else to do. His father was furious, his mother disappointed. Shame wrapped itself tightly around him. But even then, he could hear the faint hum of music in his mind, a reminder that somewhere, somehow, there was a different path. He returned to odd jobs, moving from one to another like a leaf caught in an uncertain breeze. Yet in the spaces between, he began thinking about forming a band. He didn't know how it would happen. He had no money, no connections. Just the stubborn flicker of belief that music might carry him somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the prison walls. Beyond the soot. Beyond Aston itself. The streets of Aston remained grimy and narrow. But in the spaces between work and weariness, a musical current began to form. Young men, tired of factory work and dead-end jobs, began trading shifts for guitars, pubs for practice halls. Ozzy hungered to join them. He'd scribbled a sign on scrap paper. Ozzy Zig needs gig. A hopeful, awkward plea for a place in a band. He hung it in a local music shop, its ink smudging under the fingerprints of passers-by. It caught the eye of an old schoolmate, Terence Geezer Butler. Geezer remembered the odd kid from school, the one who made funny faces and jokes. But now Ozzy was promising to sing. Geezer played bass in a band that was still forming its bones. He wasn't sure if Ozzy had the voice, but curiosity outweighed doubt. Ozzy turned up for the meeting, his presence still uncertain. His confidence worn thin by years of disappointment. But when he opened his mouth to sing, something curious happened. His voice wasn't trained. It wasn't polished, but it carried something different. A raw, aching quality, a wail that felt both haunted and defiant. Tony Iommi, the guitarist, was there too. He had his own scars. As a teenager, Tony had lost the tips of 2 fingers in a factory accident, a brutal reminder of the industrial city's dangers. But rather than surrender the guitar, he'd fashioned thimbles to cap his injured fingers, lowering the pitch of his strings to make playing possible. That down-tuned, heavy sound became his signature. Deep, ominous, and unlike anything else in the clubs. With Ozzy on vocals, Geezer on bass, Tony on guitar, and Bill Ward on drums, the foundation was laid. They called themselves Polka Tulk Blues Band, a name as clumsy as it was forgettable. For a time, they played blues covers, fumbling their way through the same standards as every other local band. But it wasn't enough. The sound wasn't theirs yet. They watched as other bands wore sharp suits and played to clean-cut crowds. That wasn't who they were. Their music needed to reflect the world they knew. The heavy, grinding pulse of factories, the constant nearness of death and danger, the gray oppressiveness of Aston itself. The transition was gradual. Geezer, a fan of occult books and dark stories, began writing lyrics steeped in doom and fear. Tony's guitar riffs grew slower, heavier, like the rumble of distant machinery. Then came the song that changed everything. One night, rehearsing in a cramped room, they struck upon a riff that sounded like a funeral toll. Combined with eerie lyrics about visions and terror, it felt unlike anything else, a sound both terrifying and exhilarating. They decided to rename themselves Black Sabbath, borrowing from a 1963 horror film that Geezer had seen. The name fit, but it felt like a dare to the world, a promise that their music wouldn't offer comfort but confrontation. What they were crafting was something no one had named yet. Heavy metal wasn't a term in 1969, but they knew, instinctively, that their sound was heavy. In weight, in mood, in presence. In tiny clubs and pubs, they played their grinding, doom-laden songs to audiences who didn't always know what to make of them. Some jeered. Some stood, entranced. Ozzy stood at the center of it all, his eyes wide, and his voice soaring. He wasn't polished, but he was undeniable. He sang with the intensity of someone clawing his way out of a deep hole, voice cracking against the weight of the music. This was no longer John Osbourne the dropout, the petty thief, the prisoner. This was Ozzy Osbourne, frontman of something entirely new. Black Sabbath was not just a name. It was a mood, a shadow that trailed the band wherever they went. In the late 1960s, when most bands still played bright pop or psychedelic rock, Sabbath's music felt like a storm cloud pressing low over the heads of listeners. When they played in dingy clubs, the crowd would fall still, as if caught in a spell. The music was thick and slow, each note a heavy footstep on a creaking floor. Ozzy's voice didn't soar in the usual sense. It cried out, as if calling to something unseen and unwelcome. The band's sound was taking shape, but what they lacked was a record. In 1969, their gigs caught the attention of a small label, Vertigo Records, known for signing the strange and the daring. The band was offered a chance to record an album. They didn't have the luxury of time or indulgence. Money was tight. Studio time was expensive. They stepped into Regent Sound Studios in London in October 1969. The walls were close, the equipment basic. But what they created inside those walls was anything but ordinary. They recorded their entire debut album in a single day. The music was raw, unpolished, almost live in its feel. They didn't aim for perfection. They aimed for power. The album was simply called Black Sabbath. The cover, depicting a shadowy woman in a desolate landscape, mirrored the music within, eerie, unsettling, and irresistible. The title track opened with the sound of rain and a distant church bell, setting a scene of dread before the first crushing riff arrived. It was slower than most rock of the time, heavier and deeper. Ozzy's vocals emerged like a voice in a nightmare, calling out about figures in black, visions of the devil, and the chill of fear. Other tracks like "And I Be" and "The Wizard" combined bluesy roots with a thickness that felt brand new. When the album was released on Friday, the 13th of February 1970, it sent a ripple through the music world. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as crude or simplistic. Others feared it. But young listeners, especially those in industrial towns and cities, heard something different. They heard music that sounded like their lives, hard, oppressive, but strangely beautiful in its darkness. The album sold quickly. Sabbath wasn't just playing music. They were creating a new language for a generation that didn't see themselves in the shimmering world of pop stars. They followed it quickly with a second album, Paranoid, recorded under similar urgency. It contained the songs that would become legends: Paranoid, Iron Man, and War Pigs. Paranoid shot up the charts, not just in Britain but across the Atlantic in America. Ozzy stood at the center, his voice cutting through Tony's monstrous riffs like a flare in the dark. He wasn't polished. He wasn't trained. But he was unforgettable. With 2 albums in a year, Black Sabbath had not only defined their sound, they had defined a genre that didn't yet have a name. Heavy metal was being born, forged in the grime of Birmingham and the fear in their lyrics. Ozzy had gone from a boy who couldn't finish school to the frontman of a band that sounded like the end of the world. Success, when it finally arrived, came fast and loud. By the early 1970s, Black Sabbath was no longer just a local oddity. They were touring the world, playing to packed halls and arenas where fans screamed and swayed to the pulse of their heavy sound. America embraced them with particular fervor. The vastness of the United States seemed to mirror the weight of their music. Sprawling, relentless, and wild. Ozzy was both overwhelmed and exhilarated. The boy from Aston, who had barely traveled beyond his neighborhood, was now waking up in hotel rooms across continents. Every city blurred into the next. A carousel of stages, limousines, and after-parties. With fame came excess. The band traveled with crates of alcohol. Beer was a given, but it was the harder drinks that filled the spaces between shows. Whiskey, vodka, anything that burned on the way down. Drugs, too, became a constant companion. It started with marijuana, a soft haze to dull the sting of exhaustion. But soon, stronger substances made their way into the backstage rituals. Cocaine, quaaludes, LSD. Ozzy embraced them all with a kind of frantic joy. He wasn't alone in this. The entire band partook, each man chasing his own form of oblivion. But Ozzy, with his restless spirit and need for laughter, pushed the furthest. Some nights, he barely remembered stepping onto the stage. Other nights, the music was the only thing that kept his feet from collapsing beneath him. Their fame meant more records, more tours. Albums like Master of Reality and Vol. 4 deepened their sound. The riffs got heavier, the lyrics darker. But behind the curtain, the band was starting to fray. There were nights when Ozzy would wake up in hotel rooms with no memory of how he got there. His pockets would be full of crumpled cash and receipts from cities he didn't remember visiting. Fans adored his onstage persona, the wild, wide-eyed singer who seemed on the edge of something unhinged. But offstage, the boundaries between Ozzy the performer and Ozzy, the man, began to blur dangerously. There was a part of him that believed this was what being a rock star meant. Drink until the walls blurred. Snort until your mind felt distant. Sleep was optional. Sobriety was suspicious. Yet, despite the chaos, the band kept producing music that defined an era. Their albums were not just records. They were statements, grim reflections of a world filled with war, pollution, and anxiety. We're pigs, with its sneering condemnation of politicians and generals, felt like a sermon shouted from a crumbling pulpit. Iron Man, with its lumbering riff, became an anthem for misfits and outsiders. And through it all, Ozzy's voice carried that same haunted urgency. But behind the music, something was shifting. The drugs weren't just a party anymore. They became necessary just to keep moving. Ozzy didn't yet know it, but the same force that had propelled him out of Aston was now threatening to pull him back into another kind of prison, one built not of stone walls, but of substances he couldn't refuse. For now, though, the roar of the crowd drowned out the warnings. The Prince of Darkness was just beginning to ascend. Fame had cracked open a door, and Ozzy ran through it at full speed. By the early 1970s, Black Sabbath was a machine that rarely stopped moving. Tours stacked one upon another, crisscrossing continents, leaving behind a trail of broken hotel rooms and foggy memories. The band lived out of suitcases, private jets, and dark buses that hummed down endless roads. For Ozzy, life became a blur of cities that all looked the same from behind a tour bus window. There were theaters one night, stadiums the next. Some mornings he'd wake in a new country without remembering how he'd gotten there. The crowds merged into one giant, roaring presence, a faceless mass that craved the heaviness Sabbath delivered. Touring was a ritual of extremes. Days began late, with curtains pulled tight against the sun. Booze came before breakfast, if there was breakfast at all. The air smelled of stale beer and burnt cigarettes. The nights belonged to the stage. There, Ozzy felt alive, possessed by the music. He would leap, howl, stretch his body wide, as though he could hold the audience in his arms. Sweat would soak his clothes, and his voice, that strange, desperate wail, cut through the wall of guitars and drums. But when the lights went down and the amplifiers cooled, the silence returned. And with it came the need to fill it. Alcohol became the easy answer. It dulled the senses, blurred the loneliness that crept in even in crowded rooms. Then came the drugs. First to heighten the high, later just to stay awake, or sleep, or feel nothing at all. The band tried to stay connected, but fame had a way of stretching bonds thin. They fought often, sometimes over music, more often over nothing. Misunderstandings sharpened by exhaustion and ego. There was a growing sense that Ozzy was drifting even among his own bandmates. His antics, once funny, became unpredictable. He missed sound checks. Sometimes he wandered off before a show, leaving managers in panic. He wore his excess like a second skin. He drank until he blacked out, snorted lines just to level the fog. Pills sat on every table, crumbled into powder or swallowed whole. Yet the public loved the myth of Ozzy, the wild man of Sabbath, the clown prince of debauchery. He leaned into the role because it was expected, and because he didn't know how to stop. One tour bled into another. There were stretches where Ozzy claimed he didn't recall months of his life. Photographs from that time feel like postcards from a stranger's journey. Ozzy grinning with wide, empty eyes, always holding a drink, always surrounded by smoke and strangers. Sometimes, in fleeting moments of clarity, he'd call home to his parents in Birmingham. His mother's voice on the line was a fragile thread back to a simpler time. But the calls never lasted long. The road always called him back. The band's success kept climbing. Albums continued to sell. The music grew darker, more ambitious. But the spaces between songs were growing more dangerous. Ozzy was no longer just living the life of a rock star. He was surviving it, barely, one night at a time. The Prince of Darkness was learning that every ascent comes with a shadow, and his was growing longer by the day. Ozzy Osbourne's body became a vessel for every substance that crossed his path. At first, the drugs had been a kind of seasoning, a way to make the long hours on the road more bearable, to sharpen the highs and dull the lows. Psychedelics were plentiful in the early days. LSD taps passed between musicians and fans like communion wafers. On acid, the stage, lights bled into one another. The music stretched and bent, and the faces in the audience seemed to melt into each other. Ozzy reveled in it. The trips twisted the world into strange shapes, made the nights feel infinite. But the afterglow never lasted. Soon, there was cocaine. It was the opposite of psychedelics. Sharp, fast, ruthless. Cocaine brought energy when the body had none left to give. A line here, another there, until the nights blurred into a single jittery reel. For Ozzy, cocaine became a companion that never left his side. He didn't just use it, He depended on it. It kept his mind buzzing, his body moving, his voice rising even when his throat was raw. The habit grew uncontrollable. The band had an almost bottomless supply on tour, dealers meeting them backstage or in hotel suites. Sometimes the cocaine came mixed with other powders, sometimes pure enough to burn. Ozzy's nose bled frequently, his skin turned pale and waxy, and his eyes darted like a man forever startled. But it wasn't just cocaine. Pills, uppers to wake, downers to sleep, joined the parade. Valium qualudes. Anything to steer the mood in one direction or another. There were days he'd start drinking the moment his eyes opened, chasing the burn with pills, then smoothing it all with a line or two. By the time night came, the substances coursing through his veins were a cocktail of contradictions, each trying to claim a piece of him. The people around him tried to manage it, to coax him into moderation, but Ozzy was uncontainable. He believed this was how a rock star should live, fast, loud, reckless. He laughed off the warnings, dismissing them as jealousies or nagging. Yet inside, there was a growing emptiness. The drinks and drugs didn't fill the hollow spaces anymore. They merely delayed the reckoning. He began forgetting entire days, waking up in strange rooms, unsure how he'd gotten there. Sometimes there was blood on his hands or bruises he didn't recall earning. There were brushes with danger, hotel rooms trashed beyond recognition, altercations with strangers, blackouts that stretched for hours, even days. On the surface, he was still Ozzy, the madman of Sabbath, the unpredictable force with a manic grin. But beneath the surface, the man was unraveling. The drugs weren't just fuel anymore. They were. The chains binding him to a spiral he could no longer control. He didn't see it yet. But those around him, his bandmates, his family, saw a man teetering on a precipice, and the fall was coming. By the late 1970s, the seams of Black Sabbath were strained to breaking. What had begun as a shared brotherhood, forged in the smoke and fog of Birmingham, was now tangled in resentment and exhaustion. The music was still there, heavy and relentless, but the spaces between songs were filled with silence, the kind that no longer felt comfortable. Ozzy was adrift, even within the band he had helped create. His addictions had become impossible to ignore. Sessions were missed. Gigs were jeopardized. His voice, though still commanding on stage, was often slurred and lost when the curtain fell. The other members were hardly saints. They too indulged in their share of substances. But Ozzy's descent was steeper, more visible, more chaotic. Rehearsals turned into shouting matches. Some days, Ozzy wouldn't show up at all. Other days, he'd arrive too drunk or too high to sing properly. The band's frustration hardened into resignation. It wasn't just the music that was suffering. Personal relationships had withered. The bond that had carried them from Aston to the world stage was now frayed, held together by little more than obligation. In 1979, the decision was made. Quietly, awkwardly, painfully, they fired him. Ozzy didn't see it coming, though in hindsight, the signs had been there for months. When the news landed, it hit like a blow to the chest. Black Sabbath wasn't just his band. It was his identity, his escape from the factories, from prison, from the streets of Birmingham. It was the only thing he had done that mattered. And now, he was outside of it. He retreated to a hotel room in Los Angeles. The days blurred again, but this time, without the promise of a stage waiting at the end of the night. He drank endlessly, barely eating, the curtains drawn tight against the California sun. For weeks, maybe months, he sank into himself, numb and lost. He described that time as his surrender, living in filth, surrounded by empty bottles and dirty clothes, his only company the dull throb of hangovers and headaches. He believed it was the end. Ozzy had never been trained for anything else. Music had been his one way out, and now even that door was closed. In the quiet moments between drinks, he might have heard the faint echo of his own voice, the voice that once roared across arenas. But it felt distant now, like a memory from someone else's life. His band was moving on. Black Sabbath continued, bringing in a new singer, recording new music. But Ozzy remained in that room, staring at the walls, waiting for something, though he didn't know what. He was 30 years old. The Prince of Darkness, it seemed, had burned out. Or so he thought. The days in that sunless Los Angeles hotel room might have swallowed Ozzy whole, if not for the unexpected knock on his door. It was Sharon Arden. She had known Ozzy for years, the daughter of Don Arden, a fearsome figure in the music industry who had once managed Black Sabbath. But Sharon wasn't there as a messenger of pity. She came with an idea. She saw past the debris of empty bottles and wasted hours. Where others saw a man finished, she saw something stubborn and untapped. Ozzy was broken, but not beyond repair. Sharon believed he could make music again, not as part of Sabbath, but as something new. At first, Ozzy laughed bitterly. He was nothing without the band. He wasn't even sure he was alive, really. But Sharon persisted. She stayed. She cajoled, encouraged, and sometimes simply ordered him to get up, to wash, to eat. Slowly, through the fog of his despair, Ozzy began to listen. Sharon didn't just offer hope. She offered a plan. She proposed that they build a new band, that Ozzy could strike out on his own. A solo career wasn't just possible. It was necessary. What began as a lifeline soon became something deeper. Sharon's presence grew from managerial to personal. She wasn't just rebuilding his career. She was anchoring his life. Their connection was unpredictable, fiery, but undeniably real. Sharon was fierce and unsentimental. She didn't coddle Ozzy, but she didn't abandon him either. Together, they started auditioning musicians. What they needed was not just talent, but a spark, a way to ignite the embers still buried inside Ozzy. Then came Randy Rhoads. Randy was young, a gifted guitarist from California, with a cherubic face and a mastery of the fretboard that bordered on supernatural. The moment Ozzy heard him play, something shifted. Here was a sound that was fresh yet melodic, heavy yet precise. Randy's guitar didn't just accompany Ozzy. It lifted him. It filled the spaces that had been hollow since Sabbath. With a new band taking shape, Ozzy returned to the studio. The process wasn't easy. He was still drinking, still dabbling in drugs, still battling the heavy shadow of self-doubt. But there was momentum now, a reason to wake up and move forward. Sharon stayed close, steering the chaos, shielding Ozzy from his worst impulses when she could, absorbing the storm when she couldn't. Together, they crafted what would become Blizzard of Oz. It was more than an album. It was proof that Ozzy wasn't a relic of the 70s. He was a voice for a new era. The songs carried a sharpness, a theatricality that set them apart. Crazy Train became an anthem almost overnight, its galloping riff and manic energy capturing the thrill and terror of life spinning out of control. Ozzy's voice, raw yet clear, sounded renewed, as though he had wrestled his way out of the grave. The album's success was immediate and undeniable. Critics who had written him off now watched in surprise. Fans old and new embraced the strange, wild energy he brought. Sharon's gamble had paid off. But beneath the ascent, the storm still gathered. Ozzy was not cured. The addictions still clawed at him. His behavior was erratic, his mind still fogged by years of excess. Yet for the first time in what felt like forever, Ozzy Osbourne was not just surviving. He was becoming something new. Randy Rhoads was unlike anyone Ozzy had ever met. Where Ozzy was impulsive and chaotic, Randy was disciplined, almost studious in his dedication to the guitar. He carried his instrument the way a scholar carried books, always close, always ready to practice, to perfect, to explore. Randy's playing blended classical precision with raw electric power. His solos spiraled like staircases to the sky, nimble fingers dancing across frets, each note a carefully placed stone in a towering structure. Ozzy watched in awe during rehearsals, often standing in quiet amazement as Randy coaxed sounds from his guitar that seemed impossible. Randy's artistry wasn't just technical, it was deeply emotional. There was a brightness to his playing, a shimmer that cut through even the heaviest riffs. His presence redefined Ozzy's music, giving it a melodic sharpness that Sabbath had never carried. Together, they recorded Blizzard of Oz, and the chemistry was undeniable. The songs felt alive, urgent, unpredictable. Mr. Crowley, unfurled with Gothic organ swells before Randy's guitar entered like a spell being cast. Suicide Solution, darkly ironic, danced on the edge of controversy, a reflection of Ozzy's own dance with mortality. But it was Crazy Train that became the standard bearer. From the opening riff to the manic pace, it was a song that captured everything Ozzy had become. Unhinged yet precise, wild yet strangely focused. The album's success was electric. Suddenly, Ozzy was not just the ex-Sabbath frontman, he was a solo star, his name alone filling arenas. Sharon kept the machinery running, managing the business, fending off the hangers-on, the exploiters, the chaos that always seemed to swirl around Ozzy. Randy remained the quiet center. He didn't party much. While Ozzy continued to drink heavily and dabble in drugs, Randy stayed somewhat apart. The diligent artist amidst the circus. Their second album, Diary of a Madman, pushed the sound further. The compositions were grander, the guitar work even more dazzling. Randy was experimenting, blending scales and styles, creating music that felt like a bridge between metal and something more ornate. Ozzy thrived in this environment, his performances sharpened by the clarity Randy's music provided. For a while, it seemed that the storm might be held at bay. The music was good, the crowds were growing, and Ozzy had found not just a bandmate, but a kindred spirit. Yet, even in this fruitful period, the dangers lingered. Ozzy's consumption didn't slow. The parties after shows were legendary, rooms filled with noise, substances of every kind. Ozzy always in the center, his laugh loud and often hollow. Still, when the music played, something clicked into place. Randy's brilliance gave Ozzy's chaos a form. They were building something remarkable, a new sound, a new legacy. And though neither of them knew it, time was running short. The 1980s suited Ozzy Osbourne's particular brand of madness. The decade was loud, excessive, and unapologetically strange. And Ozzy stood at its center like a king who had forgotten his own crown, with Sharon managing his career and Randy Rhoads refining his sound. Ozzy's solo act soared. Yet behind the music was a growing legend, not of his talent, but of his unhinged behavior. The stories became folklore almost as soon as they happened. At a meeting with record executives in a moment of drunken boredom, Ozzy released a pair of white doves meant to symbolize peace and goodwill. But as the doves flapped around the boardroom, something darker stirred in him. Without thinking, Ozzy grabbed one of the birds and bit off its head, blood spattering the stunned faces of the executives. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because the room had erupted in horror. That was Ozzy's gift, to turn discomfort into a show. The press ran wild with the story, and the legend of the bat was not far behind. During a concert in Des Moines, Iowa, a fan tossed what Ozzy thought was a rubber bat onto the stage. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and bit into it, only to discover it was very real. The bat's body twitched in his mouth, and Ozzy recoiled in shock. He was rushed to the hospital afterward, where he endured painful rabies shots. The incident cemented his image as the Prince of Darkness, a title he wore with a mix of pride and bemusement. But behind the theatrics, Ozzy was still spiraling. His drinking was relentless. He'd start the day with a drink and end it with a blackout. Cocaine remained a constant presence. Lines on mirrors or tables, just another part of the room's furniture. Touring intensified the madness. Nights blurred into one another. Hotel rooms became sites of destruction. TVs thrown out windows, furniture smashed, minibars emptied before dawn. Sharon, ever the anchor, tried to rein him in. She traveled with him, managed his career with an iron will, and occasionally dragged him out of whatever haze he had fallen into. But controlling Ozzy was like trying to catch smoke in your hands. There were moments of brilliance, though. Performances where the crowd roared so loud it seemed the walls would crack. Moments where Ozzy's voice rose through the madness and reclaimed its strange, aching power. And always, there was Randy. His playing was a beacon, a reminder that beneath the absurdity was real artistry, real music, real purpose. Yet time, like the drugs and drink, was running thin. Ozzy stood at the height of his fame, the world watching his every wild move. But even he didn't know that the next chapter would not just bring more madness. It would bring tragedy. The morning air was warm and still in Leesburg, Florida, when the tour bus pulled into a small private airstrip. It was March of 1982, and Ozzy Osbourne's band was in the middle of another relentless tour. They had been driving through the night, the long miles blurring into the usual fog of exhaustion, hangovers, and lingering highs. The bus parked near a small hangar surrounded by trees, a quiet spot where the crew could stretch their legs and wake from the heavy sleep of the road. Nearby, a small Beechcraft Bonanza plane waited. The bus driver, Andrew Aycock, had a pilot's license and convinced some of the crew to take short rides in the aircraft. Ozzy was still asleep on the bus, the remnants of the previous night's drinking still heavy in his veins. Randy Rhoads, ever the quiet soul, wasn't much interested in flying. He hated flying, in fact, but the pilot insisted, and with some coaxing, Randy agreed to go up for a brief flight. He boarded with Rachel, young blood, the band's seamstress, for what was supposed to be a playful morning distraction. But Aycock had darker intentions. He began flying low over the tour bus, attempting to buzz it, swooping down dangerously close, pulling up just in time. It was reckless, foolish bravado. On the third pass, something went wrong. The wing clipped the side of the bus. The plane spun violently, hitting a nearby tree before crashing into a garage. In an instant, it was gone. A flash of metal, wood, and fire. Randy, Rachel, and the pilot died instantly. The plane exploded, reducing the craft to twisted wreckage and ashes. Ozzy woke to the sound of chaos, of screaming, of the sharp tang of burning fuel in the air. He stumbled off the bus to see the smoke, to hear the shouts that Randy was gone. He collapsed to his knees, grief breaking over him in waves of disbelief. Randy was gone. The boyish, gentle guitarist who had pulled Ozzy from his darkest place, who had crafted the sound of his rebirth, taken in a moment of stupidity and recklessness. Ozzy was inconsolable. He described feeling like the world had ended, as if someone had reached inside his chest and torn something essential from him. The tour stopped, the band adrift without its heart. Ozzy returned to his hotel room and drank until the numbness came. But even the drink couldn't drown the image of the wreckage. The knowledge that Randy's last moments had been stolen by someone's foolish pride. Randy had been more than a guitarist to him. He was a friend, a muse, a lifeline. His death was a crack in Ozzy's soul that would never fully heal. The music felt hollow without him. The stage felt too wide, too empty. And the darkness that Ozzy carried, the one he had kept at bay with laughter, drink, and Randy's brilliance, returned with a vengeance. It was the kind of grief that didn't fade, only settled deeper with time. The Prince of Darkness was alone again. The days after Randy Rhoads' death felt to Ozzy like walking through a dense, unending fog. There was no compass, no direction, just a crushing weight on his chest that made every breath feel borrowed. Ozzy spiraled deeper into himself. The drinking, which had always been heavy, became unrelenting. He drank to forget, to sleep, to wake. Each bottle promised escape, and though it never truly delivered, he kept reaching for the next one. Drugs were no longer about fun or frenzy. They were anesthesia. Lines of cocaine blurred the hours together. Pills made time dissolve. Sometimes he took them to stay awake, sometimes to fall asleep, often unsure of which state he preferred. Sharon tried to pull him back from the ledge. She stayed close, weathering his mood swings, his breakdowns, his silences. But even she couldn't always reach him. He moved like a ghost through the remainder of the tour, filling stages with his body while his mind drifted somewhere unreachable. He sang the songs, hit the notes, but inside he was hollow. Every guitar solo reminded him of Randy, and the absence echoed louder than any amplifier. Some nights he collapsed off stage, his body unable to keep pace with the demands of grief and addiction. Other nights, he wandered hotel corridors long after midnight, lost in thoughts he couldn't articulate, eyes blurred with drink and tears. The media fed on his unraveling. Headlines painted him as a madman, a living cautionary tale of rock and roll excess. Ozzy, ever the performer, leaned into the image. If the world wanted a Prince of Darkness, he would give them one. Wild, dangerous, unpredictable. But inside, he was crumbling. He missed Randy's quiet discipline, his calming presence. The band felt adrift without him. The music lost its luster. Ozzy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He trashed hotel rooms with renewed fervor. Once, in a drugged haze, he shaved off his own eyebrows. On another occasion, he was arrested for drunkenly urinating on a historical monument in Texas, a crime that further cemented his public image as a creature of chaos. But none of it brought relief. In private, he admitted to feeling haunted, not just by Randy's death, but by his own inability to stop the spiral. He wanted to numb the ache, but the ache always returned, louder and sharper. Sharon's patience wore thin, but her resolve did not. She fought to keep his career afloat, booking shows, pushing him into studios, reminding him that music was the only thing that had ever saved him. And somewhere in the depths, Ozzy knew that too. But grief had burrowed deep, and for now, the bottle was closer than the microphone. The world saw a man unhinged, but Ozzy knew the truth. He was a man in mourning, and he didn't know how to stop. Ozzy Osbourne's public life in the aftermath of Randy Rhoads' death became a carousel of headlines, each more bizarre and damning than the last. The grief that lived inside him didn't stay private. It spilled into the streets, the hotels, the stages, anywhere his feet wandered, and the world watched. In 1982, barely months after the crash, Ozzy's spiral became national news when he was arrested in San Antonio, Texas. Drenched in alcohol and barely coherent, he had wandered away from his hotel wearing one of Sharon's dresses, the only thing he'd managed to grab before stumbling out. Somewhere in the drunken fog, he ended up at the Alamo, a site sacred to Texas history. And there, in full view of the early morning air and the few tourists present, Ozzy relieved himself against a centuries-old monument. The backlash was immediate. San Antonio banned him from performing there for a decade. Newspapers devoured the incident. He became not just a rock star, but a walking spectacle of disgrace. Ozzy himself had little memory of it. He would later describe the arrest with a mix of shame and disbelief, as though recounting the misdeeds of a stranger. The pattern repeated itself in different cities, under different circumstances. Hotel rooms looked like war zones after his stays. Furniture smashed, televisions hurled from windows, mirrors cracked from the force of thrown bottles. He traveled with a chaos that seemed both inevitable and unstoppable. His relationship with Sharon swung between passion and rage. They loved each other, that was certain, but the love often burned too hot. Their fights were legendary, sometimes loud enough to disturb entire hotel floors. Yet Sharon stayed, often dragging Ozzy back from whatever edge he was racing toward. The drugs blurred everything. Cocaine kept his heart racing. Whiskey kept the edge off. Pills knocked him out when neither worked. He often lost track of days, waking up unsure of where he was, who he was meant to be meeting, or what city the tour had reached. Fans began to expect the madness as part of the package. Saying Ozzy meant seeing the storm, the chaos, the spectacle. And so, he played the part, screaming on stage, gesturing wildly, making every performance an unpredictable act. But in the quiet moments, in hotel rooms stripped of noise, the grief returned. The ghost of Randy was always near. He tried writing letters he never sent, lyrics he couldn't finish. Sometimes he'd wake convinced he'd heard Randy's guitar in his dreams. Music still lived in him, but it fought for space in a mind overcrowded with substances and sorrow. Publicly, he was a menace. Privately, he was still mourning. The Prince of Darkness persona grew, wrapping itself around him like armor. But beneath it, Ozzy was fragile, fractured by death, addiction, and a life that had never taught him how to be still. He kept moving because stopping meant feeling, and feeling was something he wasn't ready to face. By the mid-1980s, Ozzy Osbourne's life had become a pendulum swinging between self-destruction and survival. But it was Sharon who finally forced his hand. She had endured the chaos, the arrests, the night spent waiting for a phone call that might announce his death. She wasn't willing to wait anymore. She gave him an ultimatum. If he didn't go to rehab, if he didn't at least try to pull himself back, she would leave. Ozzy, disoriented but terrified of losing her, agreed. The first time he entered rehab, it was with the reluctance of a man stepping into a cold sea. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't even fully believe in it. But something had to change. Rehab was a world apart from the stages and hotel rooms he knew. The days were regimented, the rules strict. No substances, no hiding. Just himself, laid bare before strangers who called him by his real name, not his stage persona. It was difficult. The first days were a storm of withdrawal. Headaches that felt like lightning behind his eyes, shakes that made his body betray him, sweats that drenched his sheets. But there was a strange clarity too. With each passing day, the fog lifted a little. He began to remember his family, his children, some of whom barely knew him as anything other than the wild figure in photographs. Sharon visited, steady as ever. She brought pieces of his real life. Photos, letters, memories of what waited beyond the walls. Ozzy didn't become clean in a straight line. He stumbled, relapsed, returned. Addiction was a winding road, not a door that closed neatly. But through it, he began to see himself not just as the Prince of Darkness, but as a father, a husband, a man who had outrun death more than once. Their family began to take shape around these efforts. Sharon was no longer just his manager. She was his wife, the woman who could shout him awake, pull him back from the edge, or hold him when he shook. Children filled the house. A chaotic, noisy, loving household where the shadow of addiction still lingered, but where laughter lived too. Ozzy tried to be present, though his mind sometimes wandered. He was learning, slowly, to live without the crutch of drink or drugs. Music remained a tether. He returned to the studio, to the stage. But with caution now, aware that every performance was a test of his endurance, his resolve. Rehab hadn't made him whole, but it had reminded him that he wasn't a ghost. He was still here, still breathing, and maybe, just maybe, still capable of change. Recovery for Ozzy Osbourne was never a straight path. Every day sober felt like a fragile victory, but the shadow of addiction was always nearby. A quiet voice that whispered in the stillness, reminding him of old comforts. There were days when the craving was too much. He would slip. A drink taken in secret, a pill swallowed with the promise of just this once. But with Ozzy, one was never just one. The relapses came like storms, fast, consuming, and unpredictable. Sharon watched them happen with weary eyes, her patience tested but never fully broken. She knew Ozzy's battle was not just against substances, but against himself. For every step forward, there seemed to be a stumble back. Yet, each time, he tried again. Rehab wasn't just a one-time fix. He entered programs more than once, seeking guidance, therapy, medication, whatever combination might hold the darkness at bay. The public image of Ozzy oscillated. One moment he was a reclaimed legend, sober and focused, speaking candidly about his struggles. The next, headlines announced another incident, another drunken episode, another bender caught by cameras. But the family became his tether. At home, his children laughed and screamed and demanded his attention in ways that no audience ever could. They saw through the rock star facade. To them, he was dad, silly, and strange, often absent, but always theirs. Ozzy adored them. He wanted to be better, if only to see them grow up, to be part of a life that wasn't just hotel rooms and hospitals. Sharon stood guard over the household, her love fierce and uncompromising. She shielded the family from the worst of the public scrutiny, managing the business side of Ozzy's career while also managing him. Music continued to flow, though now with longer gaps between albums. The fire was still there, but tempered, slowed by age, by recovery, by the weight of years lived too fast. Yet, in quieter moments, the old cravings whispered still. He admitted often that sobriety was a daily fight, one he sometimes lost. He never fully conquered his demons, but he faced them, again and again. For Ozzy, recovery was not an ending. It was a state of motion, moving forward despite the pull of the past, despite the part of him that still romanticized the blur of it all. He wasn't clean, not completely, not forever, but he was still here, still trying. And for someone who had once expected to die by 30, that was something close to a miracle. Ozzy Osbourne might have spent the rest of his days drifting between albums, tour, and the tug of his old vices, if not for the strange, accidental reinvention that began in his home. By the late 1990s, reality television was emerging as the next great spectacle. A producer approached Sharon with a curious proposition: to film the daily life of the Osbourne family. At first, it sounded absurd. Ozzy, the aging rocker known for bats and blackouts, wasn't exactly primetime material. But Sharon saw the potential, not just for exposure, but for something more intimate. Ozzy was reluctant. The idea of cameras in his home, capturing his every stumble and mumble, felt invasive. But Sharon convinced him, as she always did. And so, in 2002, the Osbournes debuted on television. What emerged was something no one could have predicted. Audiences didn't see the Prince of Darkness. They saw a confused, often bumbling, but endearing man trying to navigate family life, swearing at misbehaving dogs, struggling with remote controls, mumbling through conversations while his wife and children orbited around him with their own vibrant chaos. Ozzy became a star again, but not as the unhinged rocker, as the bewildered, grumbling patriarch of a thoroughly modern, messy family. The show was a cultural phenomenon. Fans old and new tuned in not for the music, but for the moments of awkward affection, the laughter, the occasional blow-up between family members. Ozzy's vulnerability became his charm. His confusion was relatable. His affection for Sharon, his pride in his children, his exasperation with everyday life, it all painted a portrait of a man who was no longer just a legend, but a human being. He wasn't always sober during filming, and the strain of constant visibility sometimes drove him back to old habits. But there was something healing, too, in being seen, not as a rock star, but as a husband, a father, a man trying to find his place in a world that had changed while he wasn't looking. Music didn't stop. He continued to record, to tour, to perform. But now, there was a new layer to his fame. People on the street didn't just shout about Sabbath. They called out his name from the TV, laughing with him, not just at him. The show gave the family wealth, but it also gave Ozzy something quieter, a sense of place, of belonging, of being more than just the sum of his excesses. The seeds of his reinvention had been sown, not with a record, but with the simple, messy truth of family life broadcast to millions. For the first time in decades, Ozzy wasn't running from himself. He was learning, slowly, awkwardly, to just be. Cameras arrived quietly at first. No grand sets, no scripted lines, just a crew, some lights, and a family that didn't quite know what they had agreed to. It was 2002, and Ozzy Osbourne was about to become something he'd never imagined. A reality television star. The home was large, but lived in. Dogs barked in every room. There were paintings and oddities on every wall, a reflection of years of eccentric collecting. The house was less a mansion and more a labyrinth of memories and mayhem. Ozzy shuffled through the rooms in slippers, muttering curses under his breath, often unaware of which camera was watching. He was still shaky, still forgetful, his speech a blend of mumbling and swearing. But it wasn't an act. He was, as always, simply Ozzy. Sharon ruled the household with a mixture of sharp humor and steel resolve. Their children, Jack and Kelly, brought their own storms. Rebellious, loud, and fully aware that the world was about to watch them grow up in real time. From the first episodes, the Osbournes was different. It wasn't polished. It wasn't glamorous. It was messy, loud, imperfect, and utterly human. Audiences loved it. They watched Ozzy try to operate the television, fumbling with remotes and wires, his frustration growing with every button pressed. They watched him yell at the family's unruly pets, each one leaving trails of chaos through the house. But they also saw his affection. The way he looked at Sharon when she laughed, the pride in his eyes when his children showed flashes of kindness or brilliance. For all his fame, Ozzy didn't hide behind the camera. He let it see the confusion, the aches in his bones, the moments of lost thought when the years of damage caught up with him. He didn't pretend to be wise or sober or even fully present, but he was real. And in a world of manufactured celebrity, that reality was gold. The show became an immediate success. Ratings soared. Ozzy's album sales rose. Again. He was invited onto talk shows, parodied on sketch comedies, referenced in places that had never once cared about heavy metal. He became both a legend and a lovable figure of pop culture, the bat-biting rock star who couldn't work a DVD player. The public saw the contradictions. The man who once terrified audiences now muttering about lost shoes. The Prince of Darkness asking Sharon where his slippers were. But perhaps most remarkable was how Ozzy himself reacted. He didn't mind being laughed at, not when the laughter was warm. He wasn't pretending to be anything. If people loved the shambolic, confused man on their screens, that was fine with him. And in those years, something subtle happened. For the first time, perhaps in his entire life, Ozzy was fully visible, not as a persona, not as a myth, but as a man. And the world, to his surprise, loved him for it. The success of the Osbournes was not just a fleeting curiosity. It was a cultural wave. Each week, millions tuned in to witness the strange, stumbling domesticity of a family unlike any other on television. And at the center of it all was Ozzy, wandering through his own house like a man still unsure of where he'd woken up. There was something endearing in his confusion. He wasn't pretending to be the patriarch. He was the bewildered passenger in a house driven by dogs, teenagers, and Sharon's iron will. The public couldn't get enough. They laughed at his constant refrain of Sharon, yelled from distant rooms, a helpless summons to his wife whenever he lost track of time, place, or the television remote. His mutterings, half-sentences laced with profanity, became catchphrases. The once fearsome face of heavy metal was now a beloved figure of domestic chaos. For Ozzy, it was surreal. He had spent decades being the man parents warned their children about, the devil in leather, the madman with wild eyes. Now, parents watched him alongside their children, chuckling as he tripped over his own words or cursed at misbehaving pets. Yet fame, in this new form, brought its own kind of exhaustion. The cameras were always there. Every mistake, every moment of weakness, every argument or accident was recorded, edited, and broadcast. There was no hiding. For someone like Ozzy, a man who had lived half his life in a blur of substances, this visibility was both comforting and suffocating. He enjoyed the affection, the strange warmth the world now sent his way. Fans approached him on the street, not with fear, but with fondness. They asked for photos, told him their favorite moments from the show. But when the cameras left, the house often fell quiet, and the familiar ache returned. There were still days when Ozzy wrestled with the pull of his addictions. Sobriety was still fragile. The attention helped, but it didn't heal. The laughter of strangers couldn't replace the steady strength needed to face mornings without a drink. Still, he kept moving forward. Sharon remained the anchor, managing the business, the family, the man himself. The children grew. Jack and Kelly, once wild teenagers on screen, began forging their own paths in the shadow of their family's fame. And Ozzy, he remained Ozzy. The public loved him not despite his flaws, but because of them. The Prince of Darkness, once feared, was now embraced. A reminder that even legends can be human, confused and clumsy in the light of day. And though he stumbled often, he had found something he'd never expected. The world wasn't laughing at him. They were laughing with him. Fame has a way of reshaping everything it touches, even within the walls of a home. For the Osbournes, the sudden glare of television lights brought both gifts and burdens. The family was wealthy, beloved, and constantly in the public eye. But the cameras, always watching, changed how they lived together. Ozzy watched his children, Jack and Kelly, navigate the spotlight with a mixture of pride and quiet concern. They were clever, outspoken, funny, and just like him, they now carried the weight of being public figures. Jack, sharp-witted and restless, wrestled with his own vices. The world saw his mischief, but Ozzy saw himself, a young man tempted by the same shadows that had nearly consumed him. Kelly, bold and unfiltered, became a star in her own right. She stepped onto stages, released music, and carried herself with a fierceness that echoed Sharon. But with fame came scrutiny. The tabloids circled her every move, her appearance, her words. Ozzy watched helplessly at times, knowing too well how fame could sharpen its claws on the young. At home, the dynamic was a mixture of affection and exhaustion. Sharon remained the center, keeping the family from spinning apart. She managed the finances, the appearances, the logistics, all while nurturing and sometimes fiercely protecting her children from the worst of public obsession. For Ozzy, the role of father never came naturally. He loved deeply, but clumsily. His mind still wandered, sometimes lost in old habits, sometimes just lost. Yet when his children laughed, when they shared quiet moments over meals or music, he felt something close to peace. The cameras eventually left, the show concluding after several seasons. But the impact lingered. The Osbournes were no longer just a family. They were a brand, a legend of reality television. And beneath that legend were real people, still figuring out how to live together when the lights dimmed. Ozzy sometimes sat quietly in the family's living room, watching old footage from the show, his own face looking back at him like a stranger. He saw his confusion, his stumbles, his laughter, all preserved, all public. It was bittersweet. The show had given them wealth and visibility, but it had also captured moments they could never reclaim, laid bare for the world to interpret. But amidst the noise, the Osbournes had each other. The love was messy, loud, imperfect, but it was there. And for Ozzy, that was enough. The Prince of Darkness had built a home, and in its walls, there was something he had once thought impossible. A family that loved him not despite his flaws, but because of them. Time, relentless and quiet, began to settle its weight on Ozzy Osbourne. The years of excess, of relentless touring, of substances that had battered his body, began to collect their toll. The wild man of rock, who had once danced and howled under stage lights for hours, now found his steps slower, his bones more fragile. It started with tremors, subtle at first, a slight shaking of the hands, a stiffness in his movements. At first, Ozzy brushed them off. A lifetime of drinking, of drug use, of hard living. Surely this was just the price of all that indulgence. But the tremors grew persistent. His body felt stiff in the mornings, his balance uncertain. Then came the diagnosis: Parkinson's disease. The words landed like stones, heavy and undeniable. The condition explained so much. The shaking, the stiffness, occasional slurring of his speech. It was a degenerative disorder, slow but steady, a thief that would continue to steal from his body year by year. Ozzy shared the news with the world in 2020. He did it quietly, with the tired honesty of a man who had fought too many battles to pretend anymore. The public, once again, responded with warmth. They had watched him fall and rise so many times before. Now, they watched with compassion, with understanding that even legends must one day face their limits. But Parkinson's was not the only challenge. Ozzy's body bore the scars of years on the road: broken bones from falls, surgeries to repair spinal injuries, hospital stays that blurred together. He underwent neck surgery after a fall in his home, aggravated an old injury, leaving him weakened and frustrated. Each procedure was a reminder that time, once outrun, had caught up. Yet Ozzy did not surrender easily. He committed to physical therapy, to treatment plans, to medications that steadied his hands, if only for a while. Sharon remained by his side, as she had always been. Fierce, protective, pushing him to fight for every day of clarity and strength. His family gathered closer, their presence a buffer against the inevitable decline. He still made music. He still stepped onto stages when his body allowed it. And though the steps were slower, the voice, that odd, piercing wail, still carried echoes of the man who had once screamed to the heavens. He joked often, calling himself a medical miracle, the man who should have died a dozen times over but somehow still woke up every morning. There was humor, there was resignation, but above all, there was gratitude. Ozzy had never expected to live past 30. Now, well into his 70s, he woke each day with bones that ached but a heart that remembered. The Prince of Darkness, fragile but unbowed, still stood. And for Ozzy, that was enough. Even as his body weakened, Ozzy Osbourne's mind refused to stand still. Music had always been his lifeline, the thread pulling him forward no matter how tangled the years became. And so, despite Parkinson's, despite the surgeries and the aches that came with age, he continued to create. In the quiet of his home studio, he found a familiar rhythm. The rituals of writing, of singing, of hearing. The first echoes of a new song still brought a flicker of youth to his eyes. Producers, musicians, and collaborators came through his doors, some old friends, some new. And Ozzy, weathered but eager, poured himself into the work with the urgency of someone who knew time was precious. In 2020, he released Ordinary Man, his 12th solo album. It was his first in nearly a decade, and it arrived like a message in a bottle, a testament that the voice still lived, that the songs still came. The album was reflective, at times mournful, filled with nods to mortality and legacy. Yet it was also vibrant, crackling with the energy of a man who still had something to say. Collaborations with the likes of Elton John and Slash brought a richness to the sound, weaving together the threads of classic rock's long history. The title track, Ordinary Man, stood as a kind of soft confession, a man peering back over a lifetime of chaos and asking for nothing more than to be remembered, not as a legend, but simply as a man. Fans embraced it, grateful to hear Ozzy's voice once again. Aged, yes, but unmistakable. He didn't stop there. The spark rekindled, and in 2022, he returned with Patient Number 9, a record that defied the expectations of age and illness. The album pulsed with defiance. The riffs were sharp, the production bold. Collaborators like Jeff Beck, Tony Iommi, and Eric Clapton joined in. Old titans lending their hands to a friend who refused to be silent. The music wasn't just nostalgia. It was a statement. Ozzy was still here. Still loud. Still strange. Recording wasn't easy. There were days when the tremors interfered, when the body wouldn't cooperate. But the voice, cracked and worn, still found its way to the microphone, still delivered the rawness that had defined him since Birmingham. Each album felt like a gift, not just to fans, but to himself. Proof that he was not yet finished. Ozzy often said he didn't know how to stop. Music was not just a career. It was breath, pulse, memory, a tether to life itself. In every lyric, every guitar riff, there was the echo of a boy from Aston who had once stared into the factory smoke and dreamed of something more. He had found it, and evened. Now, with hands that sometimes shook, he held on to it with all his might. Because making music meant he was still alive. And for Ozzy Osbourne, that was all that mattered. In his twilight years, Ozzy Osbourne found himself surrounded not by the roar of amplifiers, but by the quieter sounds of family, of reflection, of a life improbably still unfolding. He often joked that he was the man who wouldn't die. The doctors had predicted his demise more than once, the tabloids countless times more. Yet every morning he still opened his eyes, still stood. Sometimes with difficulty, but always with intent. Legacy was a word that followed him now. It whispered from the awards on his shelves, from the gold and platinum records that lined the walls. He had been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Black Sabbath, honored as a solo artist, immortalized in the strange halls of pop culture. But for Ozzy, the truest legacy wasn't in the trophies. It was Sharon, steadfast and fierce, still by his side after decades of storms. Their marriage had bent, stretched, nearly broken, but never completely. She remained his constant, his protector, partner in both business and life. It was his children, Jack, Kelly, Amy, each carving their own paths, carrying pieces of their father's story with them. They had grown under the weight of his shadow, yet somehow emerged with their own lights. Ozzy spoke often of gratitude. For the music, yes, but more for the improbable fact of his own survival. He had lived hard, burned fast, and yet, here he was, an aging rock star with shaky hands, a wandering mind, but a heart that still beat with wonder. He watched the world change from the comfort of his home, a quiet observer now rather than a participant in its wildness. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried the same odd blend of mischief and melancholy. He knew his time was finite. The body that had endured so much was fragile. But he didn't fear the end. He had stared down death too many times to be afraid of it anymore. He found peace in the small things. A family meal, a familiar song on the radio, a quiet morning where the pain in his joints wasn't too sharp. And sometimes, when the air was still, he remembered Birmingham. The smoke, the narrow streets, the boy who had nothing but a strange voice and a dream of more. That boy had traveled the world. He had made millions scream, had frightened parents, had become a legend. But in the end, he was just Ozzy. A husband, a father, a survivor. And in that simple truth, there was peace.